Good afternoon. We are Jeannie Lithcott and David Springer of the League of Women Voters of Palo Alto. This then is a presentation of pros and cons of the propositions and measures on the ballot of November 6, 2018. There are 11 state propositions and 5 local measures. As League members, we'll be unbiased in our presentation, neither supporting nor opposing a proposition or a measure. The first 4 state propositions, propositions 1, 2, 3, and 4, request support for selling bonds to provide money for various projects. Jeannie, I, will present those first 4 propositions, and then David will present the next 4, and we'll proceed in that fashion of alternating our presentations. Over to you, David.
Yeah, but the one thing to keep in mind is we're just providing you thumbnail sketch. We're going to give you the basics of each initiative, but we really encourage you to go beyond that if you have questions. You can read the text of the ballot itself, the measure itself, or the initiative in your ballot. There's other information in your ballot. There's a wealth of information online. If you have questions and you're not sure how you want to vote, go just look on the internet, look in your ballot. You'll find the answers so you can vote the way you want to vote. Over to you, Jean.
Thank you. And so now to Proposition 1. Proposition 1 is an effort to solve the housing crisis in California, which exists because, 1, there isn't enough housing for the need, and 2, the costs of both ownership and renting have risen so dramatically. California gets $2 billion annually from the federal government to support housing projects, and typically 100,000 houses and apartments are built in a year in California, most with private dollars. The state does provide some grants and low-cost loans to fund a portion of these housing construction costs. Clearly, it's all not enough. Proposition 1 is intended to alleviate the housing crisis by using bond money to do 5 things. 1, to build housing in existing urban areas near public transportation and to provide the necessary related infrastructure, such as water, sewer, and parks, to support that new housing. Number 2, to build or renovate rental housing, for example, apartment buildings with units reserved for low-income households for 55 years. Number 3, to encourage home ownership for low to moderate income first-time home buyers by giving them down payment assistance on existing homes or assisting them in building their own homes. 4, to build housing for rental or ownership by farm workers. And last, to provide home loans for veterans so they can buy a variety of single-family residents, which veterans pay back monthly. So this assistance is at no cost to the state. People would apply for these housing supports in a competitive state process. Now to the numbers. $450 million is for building in existing urban areas near public transit with the necessary infrastructures. $1.8 billion is for multi-family low-income residents, that is apartments. $450 million for low to moderate income families to buy or build their first home. $300 million for farm worker housing. 1.0 billion for veterans to purchase homes or farms, which is paid back monthly by the veterans, which comes to a total of $4.0 billion. Supporters of Proposition 1 say, Prop 1 is the only proposition that directly addresses the housing shortage by building more affordable homes and without raising taxes. Supporters also say these programs will bring relief from the crushing housing crisis for so many who need it, will enable more people to live close to where they work, will get many people off the streets and into housing, and will provide tens of thousands of new jobs in this construction, and so create an economic boost. Opposers of Proposition 1 say the $4 billion goes to a variety of programs that may or may not repay the money for revolving use. Opponents also say it lessens the housing shortage for a limited number of persons. And finally, that the problem requires far bigger solutions than Proposition 1 is. Now to Proposition 2, another bond for building. This proposition attempts to solve the problem of persons being both homeless and mentally ill. Many of the homeless who are struggling with mental health issues are not getting treatment because health providers can't find them on the streets to get them into regular care. It is known, however, that having a secure place of one's own in which to live provides strong support for mental health improvement. So 2 laws related to this combined issue were explored to try to solve this problem. The first is the Mental Health Services Act, approved by the voters in 2004, which provides money for counties to help the mentally ill, but has no provision to provide such needed housing. The second issue is that there's a law called There's No Place Like Home, and it provides permanent housing for the homeless mentally ill and was passed in 2016. But it has no provision for getting the money that's needed to actually provide that permanent housing for the homeless and mentally ill. So the idea of creating a bond funding arose, but it would require the courts to rule on 2 issues if we went that route. If using some of the money in the Mental Health Service Act for housing is consistent with what the voters wanted when they passed the Act in 2004, and then if voters would legally need to approve any proposed bonds for the There's No Place for Home, Like a Home Act. So the solution is Proposition 2. The Mental Health Services Act has been and is a fully funded program since 2004, funded from income taxes on those who earn more than $1 million a year. Up to $140 million per year would be released from that Mental Health Services Act money to facilitate getting permanent housing for the chronically homeless mentally ill. Proposition 2 is also a request to sell bonds for the $2 billion needed to fund the cost of permanent housing under There's No Place Like Home Act. These bond monies are to be repaid over many years by the $140 million per year from the MHS Act. If Proposition 2 is passed, it will go into effect immediately and will not need the court to rule on those 2 issues or any other aspect of it. Supporters say this combination of providing permanent housing to the mentally ill who are chronically homeless will help get the mentally ill off the streets, will help the mentally ill get the regular care they need to get better, and will occur without cost to taxpayers. Opposers say that much of the money will go to housing bureaucrats, not the homeless. Counties are where the effective mental health action and responsibility lie, and there will be systemic barriers to the program from communities who do not want such housing and residents in their community under any circumstance.
There is also a change in law that was passed called AB 727, which allowed Proposition 63 money to be used for rental assistance, but not permanent homes for the mentally ill. And that also is in the mix of that's available today. And opponents say that's really good enough in this space.
Thanks, David. So Proposition 3 is another bond issue. And Proposition 3 is a continuing but now huge effort to secure safe, reliable, and clean water supplies for California. This is not easy since California gets most of its water from the sky in rain and snow, over which we have no control, with a little being produced by recycling waste and by desalination. The other problem is the enormously different climates and terrain of the state, from desert to forest and mountains to meadows, as well as the widely differing population density across the length and breadth of the state. All of that means that many solutions are needed. One solution would not work for everyone. And every one of them, of the solutions that we provide, is going to cost money. It also means that most spending for water projects is by local water agencies, for instance, water districts. But Native American tribes, nonprofits, and private water companies are also there. Since 2000, voters have approved $31 billion for water projects, roughly $10 billion of which was still available this last June. Prop 3, then, is another request to sell bonds to add to that $10 billion to fund myriad different water projects in 6 broad categories that include about 100 subcategories. The categories and the actions are: on watershed lands, to protect and improve the supply and quality of water coming from these lands, the forests, meadows, wetlands, and areas near rivers. And that's going to cost $2.5 billion. And then we have an area of need in the water supply to improve and increase drinking water, wastewater treatment, recycling, collection and cleanup of rainwater and conservation. And that's going to cost us $2.1 billion. Fish and wildlife are another category. That means that we're going to try to restore streams and wetlands to more natural conditions for $1.4 billion. We need to upgrade facilities, which is to repair and restore dams, canals, aqueducts, and reservoirs for $1.2 billion. Groundwater issues require us to clean it up, recharge it, and manage it. And that's going to cost $1.1 billion. And finally, we need flood protection. We need to reduce the risk of flooding, repair reservoirs, and expand floodplains. That will cost $500 million, $500 million. Supporters say Proposition 3 meets the dire need for safe, reliable, clean water supplies. It also helps us to be prepared for ongoing drought and will also help to reduce wildfires. Opposers say that new water comes from the sky and we need more dams to collect it, but not one new dam is included in this proposition. They also say that existing dams collect silt, which as it builds up means less water is stored in the dam. Some old dams have actually been removed, but only one dam is included for silt removal. One more proposition to go, David, on the bonds. So Proposition 4 is an effort to solve the problem of how best to increase our ever-improving specialized health care for children in California. Infants and children do suffer from complex medical conditions like cancer and sickle cell. They need organ transplants and heart surgeries. There are 8 not-for-profit children's hospitals in California. 5 more are University of California children's hospitals. And many centers or wings for children's health in full hospitals exist where these specialized procedures and care are provided no matter what a family can pay. Over 2 million times per year, seriously ill children in California receive highly specialized care in those hospitals. There are also centers for pediatric research. They are becoming regional hubs of highly specialized pediatric care. In California, the cost of their patient care is provided by the California Children's Services Program and Medi-Cal. So how best to help more of these children and the physicians who serve them is to provide funds for construction to expand and remodel their facilities, to renovate and furnish new spaces there, to get new equipment as medical breakthroughs in care occur, and to help with the financing and refinancing of the work they do. So Proposition 4 is a request to sell $1.5 billion in bonds to be repaid from the state's general fund, averaging about $80 million annually for 35 years. The distribution of the money that the bond would generate would be 72% would go to the 8 nonprofit children's hospitals, 18% would go to the 5 UC children's hospitals, and 10% goes to other hospitals who have a section that's devoted to providing care for children under the California Children's Service Program. Supporters say that Proposition 4 increases the capacity at children's health centers, provides the latest in medical technology, and advances pediatric research so that more children are cured of serious illnesses. Opposers say we should look first to improve the entire healthcare system. While there are many outstanding medical professionals in California and the USA spends more than any other country on healthcare, our ranking re healthcare outcomes is far from the top of that list. The other thing opposers say is that millions of Californians do not even have basic healthcare coverage. So over to David for Propositions 5 and so on.
All right. Now, Proposition 5 is going to be an interesting one because it's all about Proposition 13 that was passed decades ago to control property tax. And I need to talk a little bit about what it does so you understand what this proposition is going to do to change that. So we all are familiar with the basics of Proposition 13. I buy a house in California, I pay property tax based off what I paid for that house. But if I stay in the house, that property tax will grow as my house gets more valuable, but only very slowly. So if I'm in that house for 10 or 20 years, I'm going to pay a lot less on my property tax than someone who just moved into the neighborhood. And that was intentional so that people could keep their homes and not priced out of their homes. But the consequence of that is it created a kind of a golden handcuff situation. At some point, your property tax is so low relative to what it will be if you move that you were afraid to move. It's actually more expensive to move. And so if you're, let's say, near the edge of retirement, you want to move to a smaller home in a cheaper area, the way Proposition 13 was set up, that kind of discourages that behavior. So people tend to stay in large homes in expensive neighborhoods a lot longer than they otherwise had, and that kind of makes it hard for new people to move into those communities. So when they passed Proposition 13, they had an escape route for this. So you could get away from those golden handcuffs, but it was very limited. You could only use it once. You could only move to a home that was cheaper than your current home, or that what you sold your current home for. You could only use it if you were over 55 or had a severe disability, and you could only really use it within your own county or maybe another county that had a specific relationship with your county. In other words, it was really hard to use this. So most people didn't benefit from this escape route. And what they did with what they're proposing with Proposition 5 is to make that sort of mouse hole of an escape route a big door that everyone can walk through who meets the qualifications. And so what they've changed is they changed almost all of those restrictions. So now you can go to any home. It could be cheaper, it could be more expensive or less expensive. It can be anywhere in California. You can move as many times as you want and carry your old property tax valuation to your new home. So you still have to be over 55 or have a severe disability, but they also have the option, if your home was basically destroyed by a natural disaster, this option is also available. So for example, when we had all those fires and a lot of people lost their home, if they sell their home and move somewhere else, they would benefit from this proposition. Now there is one other change that's a little mathematical, so I need to cover it. Is since you could go to any size home, they didn't think it'd be fair that someone would leave their home and sell it for $400,000 and buy a $3 million mansion and have the property tax still reflect what they used to have. And they also felt they wanted to reward people who moved to a lower value neighborhood. So what it does is we'll adjust your valuation. So if let's say your house was worth, I'm going to read the example, $75,000 according to your Prop 13 value, and you sold it for $500,000 and then bought another house for $800,000. So what it's going to say is you're going to carry your new value over 75, but you're also going to add to that the difference. So your new house would be worth $375,000 because you bought a more expensive house. Now, if you'd gone the other way, you sold it for $800,000 and bought a $500,000 house, your property valuation in the new home would be zero. So that's a good deal. Mm-hmm. So you can see this really makes it very advantageous for people to move when they get to the age where moving otherwise makes sense. There's no longer a financial reason not to move. So let's look at what the supporters will say. Oh, excuse me, fiscal impact. So this is not a cheap option for the state. It's $100 million in the first year. They expect it to be $1 billion over time per year. So this is a significant subsidy for those currently paying property tax. This is somewhat countered by the fact that local property tax will grow. So for example, if someone buys my house and I had a $75,000 valuation, and then someone bought it and they paid $800,000 for it, they're going to pay property tax off that $800,000. So locally, that will get more income. But it kind of depends on where you are as to who the benefit. So really expensive areas will tend to get a little bit more property tax than they used to have. Really inexpensive areas will probably get less. The other aspect of it is there's a school component, because we have other propositions that said school funding cannot just be reduced. So what happens in this situation is property taxes are reduced because someone took advantage of this loophole. The state will make up the difference out of the general fund. So for the portion spent on schools, which is a really big portion of local funding, so most of that loss will not hit local governments. It will hit the state government and the general fund, which is, it has its own consequences. But so usually high value things like cities like Palo Alto will benefit pretty well from this one. Communities where people go to retire because property values are very low probably will lose money on this opposition. So it's not a net win for everybody, but it's certainly a net win for those people who are over 55 who can take advantage of this loophole. Proponents. The proponents for this are really emphasizing this is about protecting the elderly of fixed income. It's about increasing the mobility of people so that people will move when it makes sense for them to move, that they're not locked into their residence because of the financial implications of how we set up the law. So this should encourage a lot of people who are in a neighborhood in a house that's too big for them or doesn't fit their lifestyle anymore to move, where before they might not, and that means new people can move in the neighborhood, which is a net win from the Proposition 5 supporter standpoint. Now, if you go to the opponents, they're more concerned with this is a big subsidy. It's $1 billion a year once it gets fully moved. That's a lot of local services and schools affected by that. That's a big hit to the state general fund. And seniors already get a lot of benefits from Proposition 13. Proposition 13 is almost entirely built to protect seniors. So to give them even more benefit seems excessive, or at least that's what the opponents of this proposition would say. And that's it for Proposition 5. So I hope I didn't go too fast. So let's go to 6, which is a little different change of pace. So in Proposition 6, there's also history with this one. So what happened with Proposition 6 is in 2017, the legislature passed a tax increase on gas taxes and vehicle registration taxes that was passed that would raise somewhere between $6 and $12 billion, depending upon which year you're talking about. And this was passed into law, is in law today. It's called SB 1. And then Proposition 69 last June, so just a couple months ago, was passed to mandate that this SB 1 activity can only go to transportation, as there was some fear some of this money would be redirected elsewhere. So that's history that's been done. So what this Proposition 6 is doing is it's saying that was a mistake. Let's get rid of SB 1. That tax increase was a mistake. Let's get rid of it. Take it away. Proposition 69, irrelevant, because SB 1 is irrelevant. And then we don't want it to happen again, so we're going to amend the state constitution to say anytime they want to increase taxes on gasoline, on vehicle registration, or transportation-related taxes, it has to both pass the legislature, which today requires a supermajority, and also in the future be approved by voters. So in other words, they want to make it really hard to pass future tax increases based off gas, fuel, vehicles, or transportation. Now, proponents of this law are really focused on, and the impact, of course, you collect next taxes. It's somewhere between $2 and $5 billion less collected in the near horizon, and that means less funding for transportation, roads, and streets. Proponents, gas is really the argument of the taxes are too high. There's a concern that the taxes will be diverted to non-road related projects. So that, I believe, is prior to Proposition 69. But also, they really do feel the tax increases should be directly approved by the voters. That's a philosophical point that a lot of people have, and the supporters clearly have that viewpoint. If you go to the opponents, their perspective is our roads are in lousy condition. There's a lot of delayed maintenance. California, if you look at it, its spending and road conditions compared to other states looks pretty poor in that. So we're a lot worse off than other states. There's clearly a need to fix these roads, and transportation-related taxes are the way we've historically done this, and making that whole process so much harder is just shooting ourselves in the foot. So that's kind of what the opponents say. So obviously strong viewpoints on either side. So let's go to Proposition 7, which is a complete change of pace. And this one, like all my ones, seems to require history.
Yes.
So if you go, so the history for this one goes back to 1949. So in 1949, California did a proposition to establish daylight savings time. And so all the daylight savings time where it fall back in the winter and fall, spring forward in the spring and the date changes, that's been in place since 1949. And it cannot be changed except by a ballot initiative. So we've been stable. But in 2018, the federal government weighed in on this, and they changed the law that applies to all states. And what they said is, any state that changes daylight savings time this point forward is either limited to 3 options. They can either go back to standard time all year round, which is like Arizona and Hawaii have today. You can adopt the federal standard, which is daylight savings time starts on the 2nd Sunday of March and ends on the 1st Sunday of November. Or you have to go to the federal government and get your exception approved. So we have the proposition saying you can't change it, and we have the federal law saying if you change it, you have to follow these rules. So now we have Proposition 7, which is saying we're trying to get out of this. So it's doing 2 things. First of all, it's changing the law so the legislature can change this. It's saying you don't need a proposition anymore. If Proposition 7 passes, we're giving the legislature permission to change the daylight savings rules however they want. It would require a 2/3 vote of the legislature, so it's not easy to make these changes, but they can do it. The second thing it does is it then gives a recommendation to the legislature that says, we want all year daylight savings time. So we don't want it to change every 6 months. We wanted daylight savings time all year. Now, the legislature is not required to agree with the advisory or do with your advice. It's advice, but they're obviously going to take it seriously because the voters have voted on it. Now, if they do go down the route of saying DST all year round, it still needs to go to the federal government for approval. This initiative does not change that, but it at least allows us to start the process. There's no impact as daylight savings time. There's no real dollar impact, but there are some important considerations on either side. So from an opponent's from a proponent's point of view, the time changes are stressful points in time. You've got people's biorhythms changing. They're waking up earlier. You get more traffic accidents. You get a little bit of spike in electricity and fuel usage. There's more stress-related medical conditions. There's a little spike around those time changes. So they're really trying to avoid the time changes. Now, if you look at the opponents, they're going, we've tried DST in the past. People hated it. People don't want their kids to go to school when it's all dark outside. There's really not anything that says all year round DST saves energy or money. So it's really the proponents are really about getting rid of that time change. Well, the opponents are saying DST is the wrong answer. Both or either could be right. It's your call. So we're going to go now to Proposition 8.
Before you go there, could I ask you quickly about
Sure.
that daylight savings time? Did anybody say why they wanted to do it?
I did not find a reason why daylight savings time is better than standard time.
Right, I didn't either. Yeah, thank you.
Proposition 8. Proposition 8 is in many respects similar to a later measure we have called Measure F. But what Proposition 8 is about is it's targeting a specific element of the healthcare system. What it's looking at is kidney dialysis. So this is a significant business. We have 588 licensed dialysis clinics. People who have this condition have to come in every week. Dialysis is just necessary for them to have a healthy life. Most of those patients are covered by Medicare or Medi-Cal, in which case they pay, those insurance organizations pay a fixed fee to the dialysis providers. However, all the rest of people are either on private insurance or they don't have any insurance, and they could be charged whatever the dialysis center wants to charge them, and is whatever the market would bear. This initiative is really targeting those people who aren't on Medicare or Medi-Cal, private insurance companies, and people who don't have insurance at all. And what Proposition 8 says is we want to regulate the market, or to be precise, to cap the prices that they can charge. They're not setting a flat price like $50 a visit. What they're saying is they can only make a profit of 15% on providing that service. So if the service costs $200, they can do $200 plus 15% as the maximum they could charge their customers, or their patients in this matter. There's some criteria in there on what is an appropriate qualifying cost. It's pretty broad. It covers pretty much as far as like a wide selection of what type of care will be available. There are clearly some disputes of whether some details are correct or not. But the fundamental basis is, is Proposition 8 saying we want to regulate the prices in this market as opposed to what we have today, which is really more of a free market type situation where the insurance companies negotiate with the dialysis providers. So fiscal impact is highly variable. It could be savings of tens of millions to tens of $1 million of cost to local governments and insurance providers. It really depends on how the dialysis companies respond to this. So it could be at one spectrum, they lower their prices, and otherwise nothing's changed, in which case, yay, everybody saves money. You get the other extremes and they say this business is no longer profitable, we're going to leave the business. They close down their dialysis and a lot of people suffer. And of course, everything in between. There's a lot of disagreement on what the outcome will look like. So if you look at the proponents or supporters, they're really looking at the more optimistic scenario. They're looking at the insurance costs will go down, the fees will go down, everyone will benefit across the board, or overall medical costs will be down, and it'll provide incentives for the dialysis clinics to lower their fees and keep their fees lowered. So it's all about really cost control. On the Proposition 8 opponents, they're really seeing these restrictions on pricing to be somewhat arbitrary, to discourage operation, and really it will make that business unappealing, and they'll shift to support some other aspect of the medical community, and we'll lose those dialysis clinics, which today are available in many communities. And now, at this point, I'm going to hand it over back to Jeannie for Proposition 10. Absolutely,
because Proposition 9 was withdrawn from the ballot. So Proposition 10. Proposition 10 tackles the question of how rent control, or lack of it, contributes to the housing crisis in each community. Part of the housing crisis is the runaway increases in rent. Every 5% increase in rent means 2,000 more people are forced out. Several cities have rent control laws that limit how much a landlord can increase rents from year to year. The rent control that exists statewide is governed by a state law that has been in place for many years. It is actually a law about what properties cannot be rent controlled. It's called the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act, and it stipulates that in California, one may not apply rent control to any single-family home. More, one cannot tell landlords what rent they can charge a new renter on first moving in. And lastly, one can never apply rent control to any newly built house completed after February 1st in 1995. So 3 areas are protected from rent control by the Costa-Hawkins Rental Act. So this means that anyone can charge anything at any time for rent of a single-family home or a newly built house. It's also true for the rent a landlord can charge a new renter on first moving in. They can charge whatever they want. These are 3 areas where the rents may have increased many times over during the last 20 years, and landlords have come to rely on these ever-increasing sources of profit. Prop 10 then seeks to repeal the Costa-Hawkins Act, so the amount of rent charged for a single-family home or a newly built home or a new tenant on first moving in can be restricted, limited by local rent control community standards. Another relevant law is that a landlord has a right to a fair rate of return, meaning that a landlord has a right to increase rents to make a profit. Repealing Costa-Hawkins does not mean that this law of a landlord's rights is also repealed or changed in any way, actually. So the idea is that find these three kinds of properties and to allow them now to be rent controlled, because surely that's where a lot of the exorbitant profit has occurred. Supporters say that Prop 10 does not mandate new laws or bureaucracies for any community. It gives the people the power to develop rent control for their own communities. Supporters also say that this proposition will no longer allow corporate landlords to double and triple the rents on properties that Costa-Hawkins has allowed. Prop 10, they say, answers the question, who should be deciding housing policy? Local communities or Sacramento special interests and powerful real estate inventors? Opposers of Proposition 10 say, Proposition 10 allows wealthy corporate landlords to turn apartments into condos and short-term vacation rentals rather than to be rent controlled. So we'd lose rental housing. They also say that Prop 10 allows regulation of the rent of single-family homes, but homeowners have counted on that income for such a long time, it's just not fair. The third thing they say is that Prop 10 allows that if renters, tenants, or voters challenge the new law in court, Prop 10 requires California taxpayers to pay those sponsors' legal bills.
So at the end of the day, Proposition 10 is about who controls what the rental laws. Is it done at the state level? In which case, the answer is probably going to be there's not going to be control of rents. Or is it going to be done at the local level where each community can decide for themselves?
I think it's both and, because cities like San Jose, San Francisco, and Los Angeles have rent control within the context of the city.
Mm-hmm.
But that's it. The state laws that we were talking about, Costa-Hawkins, is a statewide rule. Sure. And so that restriction on rent control has been lifted if we repeal that
Correct.
act during this proposition. Yeah. So there's a state there and a city example. Yeah, thanks. So now to Proposition 11, and this is my tough one. David had several tough ones, and I think ones that required an awful lot of explanation before. So this one, Proposition 11, is a little bit like that for me. This proposition concerns the hourly workers who make up the emergency medical ambulance crews, who respond as rapidly as possible to 9/11 calls, and the breaks those workers take during a shift. Involves those two things. To understand the issue and the problem this proposition tries to solve requires some very detailed information, and here we go. So most ambulance companies in California are privately owned, and they employ emergency medical technicians and paramedics in pairs to be the crew on their ambulances that respond to 9/11 calls. Counties employ ambulances to respond to 911 calls. And the time of response these companies can ensure is a key and necessary feature of a county's selection of which ambulance company to employ. Once a county has made decisions about which ambulance companies they're going to employ, the county creates zones within that county for ambulance deployment. But in that zone, there is no ambulance station fixed in place where EMTs wait for 911 calls, as firemen do at their fire station. The ambulances, rather, are stationed to respond most rapidly in that zone to a 911 call. And when an ambulance and crew are off to the nearest hospital, the other ambulances in that zone reposition themselves to cover the missing ambulance's spot the best they can. This practice of repositioning helps to reduce the wait time between a 911 call and the arrival of an ambulance, which is an important issue for the county and ambulance company connection. It should be acknowledged that this kind of work can be very stressful, even traumatic at times. The EMTs and paramedics are hourly workers who generally work a 12-hour shift. and the ambulance companies must follow labor laws, such as a minimum wage and that the employees take rest breaks. Most companies must provide an unpaid 30-minute meal break during each shift for these hourly employees, and a 10-minute paid rest break every 4 hours. On the one hand, this schedule is very difficult to arrange for workers whose time may be interrupted all the time by a 911 call, and the necessary immediate response, meal or not, rest or not. These workers are, in fact, on call during their whole shift because of either 911 calls or a call to reposition after another ambulance has left its spot. However, on the other hand, there are often large chunks of downtime in a shift that involves EMTs, paramedics, and ambulances. And these chunks of downtime are very often enough for meal breaks and rest breaks as they need to be. In 2016, the California Supreme Court ruled that on-call breaks violate state labor law, since they're not really breaks. So employers must provide off-duty breaks that are not able to be interrupted. Given all of that background, Proposition then makes labor law entitling EMTs and paramedic employees to take work breaks for meals and rest while still on call. But at the same time, Prop 11 regulates when during a shift meal breaks can occur. For instance, not in the first or the last hour of the shift. And if these meal breaks require extra ambulances, then private ambulance companies must operate enough ambulances to meet the need required by these meal breaks. Last, Proposition 11 also includes requirements both for additional training for EMTs and paramedics and the provision of mental health services to those employees. Supporters say that Prop 11 ensures that emergency care will not be delayed. It also ensures that EMTs and paramedics have workplace protections. And lastly, it provides mental health benefits for EMTs and paramedics in their work, which is often traumatic and stressful. Opposers to Prop 11 say there are rest breaks on every job site, but Prop 11 attaches only to EMTs and paramedics. Is it because this is not only about EMTs and paramedics as workers, but also about the private companies that own ambulances that have a reputation for speed? An unanswered question. So we're ready for Proposition 12. Proposition 12 is about an entirely different topic. It's about animals that serve us by being food for us. So in 2008, Prop 2 prohibited California farmers from housing pregnant pigs, calves raised for veal, and egg-laying hens in cages or crates that tightly restricted any movement of those farm animals. That was Prop 2 in 2008. Prop 12 now continues that effort with two trends that concern practices affecting the conditions under which those three specific farm animals are raised. One trend seeks to provide more space for these farm animals to move ever more freely. The other trend is to ban the sales of products from these farm animals that are not housed according to the new requirements. So two things are going on. Prop 12 looks toward 2020 and 2022 as dates for the completion of new space requirements for these animals. Specifically, that egg-laying hens will have 1 to 1.5 square feet of floor space each and be fully cage-free, even if indoors, by 2022. It also says that calves raised for veal will each have, by 2020, 43 square feet of floor space each, and that breeding pigs will have 24 square feet of floor space each by 2022. Proposition 12 also makes it illegal to knowingly sell eggs and uncooked pork or veal that come from animals housed in spaces that do not meet these Prop 12 requirements. Violations of the new space housing and sales ban requirements of Prop 12 will be deemed a misdemeanor, but violating the sales ban could bring a fine in civil court. Supporters say that Prop 12 will stop animal cruelty for egg-laying hens breeding pigs and calves raised for veal. They say that Prop 12 will eliminate from the marketplace unsafe products from abused animals by limiting their space dramatically. And lastly, proponents say that Prop 12 will foster the growth and development of family farms, which will provide more jobs. Opposers to Prop 12 say it does not remove egg-laying hens from cages until 2022, even though Prop 2 from 2008 said they would be cage-free by 2015. Opposers say that Prop 12 allows the cruel confinement of dairy calves in California who are not covered by these propositions. And opposers to the proposition say it involves the Humane Society of the United States, which again is promising to ban cages from the egg industry, even though it spent the last decade claiming that it already had done that.
So there's really two types of opponents to this initiative. One is as Jeannie said, are people who thinks it hasn't gone far enough.
Cool.
And there's another set of opponents who really say it's going too far and too fast, and the end result will be too expensive and disruptive to the industry. So they're two different extremes, each with the same answer.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, precisely. So I think it's over to you now for Measure A.
So we're moving to the measures, and what we had done before was the propositions, which were all statewide initiatives. When we get to the measures area, they affect smaller and smaller parts of the community, either at the county level or the city level or even the school district level. And so it's going to get a little smaller and more tactical. So Measure A is a tax increase or a tax continuation for Santa Clara County. So it only affects Santa Clara County. And what the history behind this is in 2012 was the last time we approved an increase in the sales tax. So that sales tax right now is currently 9% for the county. They go a little bit higher in Campbell and San Jose, but that extra 1/8 of a percent or 0.0125 is expired in 2023. So what this initiative is doing is says we're not going to have it expire. It's going to be a permanent tax, which means after 2023, we're going to collect an additional $50 million of sales tax revenue we otherwise would not collect. So this is taking the status quo today and having it continue rather than that tax drop in 2023 when it's currently scheduled to drop. Now this tax goes into the general fund, which means it funds all the normal activities of your county government. So it's not targeted at any specific line item in that budget, but it is part of their general funds, which is what they have the most flexibility towards using. These funds are used for law enforcement, trauma, housing, support services, transit, or anything else that's done within the county. So from a fiscal impact standpoint, obviously the existing tax is not going to go down when it's scheduled to do so. It's going to stay where it is. So it's kind of, again, a status quo going forward. Proponents of the law, or supporters, are really pointing that this is a necessary tax. We require services from our county. Those services cost money, and this is a good way to collect that money so that we could keep maintaining the services we provide today. If this measure was not passed, that money would go down and these services would have to be cut. Opponents are really arguing sort of the mirror of the same question. This is a general fund, so we don't know how we have to trust our local legislatures as to how to spend the money because there is no guarantee within the initiative. Right. The county just raised taxes a little while ago, just a couple years ago. Now we want to make it permanent. So there's always this pressure of where do you draw the tax line appropriately and not have the county collect too much in taxes. And opponents say this is crossing over that line. But overall, Measure A is relatively straightforward from most of these initiatives. This is one of the most straightforward ones. Yes. Which takes us to Measure E, which is another fairly straightforward tax-related initiative. but this one applies only to the city of Palo Alto. So there is a transit occupancy tax, or which is kind of cutely called TOT. What this is a tax paid on hotels. So when you rent a room at a hotel and you've ever gotten those fees back, there's the hotel costs and then there's fees at the bottom, which is local taxes. Those are transit occupancy tax fees. Currently in Palo Alto, those are 14%, which is pretty high. I think the average for the state is 10%, so we're a little above average. What this initiative is going to do is raise those an additional 1.5%, which will collect a little over $2.5 million in additional revenue for the city. This does raise them to be fairly high for the state when they're already a little bit on the high side. But this is extra revenue. It's, of course, general fund revenue, and it's always, cities need cash. So the supporters, at the end of the day, are saying the city has needs. It has infrastructure, as city repairs, as police and fire. These things cost money. Measure E is a good way to collect that money, and it's not a particularly burdensome tax, and it makes sense to do so. So that's what the supporters say. The people who don't support, the opponents, argue really that tax, it's, in the grand, 1.5% may not seem like much, but it makes Palo Alto have a much higher hotel tax than San Francisco and Los Angeles, which are major destination cities and might discourage hotels to operate within our city. And also it generally feels the city does not need that extra income from it, so it's not a good use. It's not the city has sufficient revenue today. They don't need this extra tax to do so. And if they do need extra money, this is not the right way to do so. So again, relatively straightforward. Both Proposition A and E are all sort of the similar message. Do you want to raise taxes to match your services, or do you want to adjust your services to match your a somewhat lower tax base? Similar question for both. You can obviously you can answer either. You don't have to answer them the same way. You answer them the way you want to.
One of the interesting things about it for me, David, was that it's the second time in 4 years that we've asked to increase the TOT.
Yes.
It's just an important issue. Yeah.
This takes us to Measure F, which is our third initiative or measure that's on a medical theme, or maybe it's the fourth. I'm losing track a bit. So Measure F is a Palo Alto specific initiative. It was originally started at the state level, and it was rejected at the state level, so they're now working their way through a number of communities, including Palo Alto, to pass legislation of this nature. And the current situation today is Palo Alto does not regulate healthcare pricing. So the prices when you go to a hospital or a dentist or a pharmacy are not regulated at the state level, or excuse me, not regulated at the city level at all. Palo Alto plays no role in that. But this measure wishes to change this. So what Measure F wants to do is say Palo Alto should regulate these pricing of healthcare, family doctors, dentists, healthcare providers of all sorts. Palo Alto should put some brakes on their pricing, regulate their pricing to make sure it's reasonable, and specifically 15% above reasonable costs. That same 15% number you saw previously. On dialysis equipment, it's a similar same logic behind this one. Healthcare providers should be restricted to, or would be restricted to, charge no more than 15%. This would probably have the largest effect on private insurance and individuals buying in medical care, but it only applies to those providers who are physically in the city of Palo Alto. Palo Alto would also have to create the infrastructure to administer, manage, audit this type of pricing, and none of that infrastructure exists today. There is a significant fiscal impact on here, but it is very uncertain. There's a significant cost for setting up that administration setup. There's a cost to health providers and whether they might move out or stay in, or even have to just do more administrative burden within their facility, and that has its own cost. The savings to insurance companies, there's just an enormous level of uncertainty around this one. So if we go to the supporters, this is about bringing healthcare costs under control. This healthcare is one of the largest single items for anyone's expenses anywhere in the nation. And certainly it's not particularly cheaper in the Bay Area or Palo Alto. So this is an approach to figure out how can we reduce that cost so that the city residents will benefit. The Measure F supporters are confident the healthcare providers will not leave the area or otherwise reduce the services provided. However, if you go to the Measure F opponents, they really have the opposite opinion. They really do feel that this is enormously costly to set up this infrastructure process. For example, Medicare has hundreds of people focused on determining what is the correct price for things. To have hundreds of people operate in Palo Alto to do this, or even something even close to that, would be enormously expensive and difficult to administer. There's also a considerable degree of legal uncertainty related to this. There are federal laws that manage and regulate healthcare. There are state laws. Those laws preempt local laws. So it'd be a very complex thing to go in there, and opponents just say this is just a wrong strategy. So
yeah,
that's Measure F. And then we'll go to Measure Y, which is another easy one and well understood one. You've seen some version of Measure Y multiple times before. This one is specific to the Palo Alto Unified School District Board, and it's to establish term limits. So right now, board members are elected for 4-year terms. They can serve as long as they keep getting reelected. What this initiative will do is limit them to 2 consecutive terms. So a maximum of 6 to 8 years. So if they started mid-term, if they do at least half a term, that counts as a full term. And then they have to take a break. They have to sit out a 4-year period before they can once again run for office. Pretty straightforward. You've seen variations of term limits all the time. The supporters of this initiative, it's all about shaking things up. You want some change in who's in charge of the district. You want some turnovers, and term limits are a reasonable way to do that. Now, however, the opponents would argue that voters have that decision-making authority anyway with elections, and also term limits have the tendency to keep knocking people out just at the point where they get experience in the job. So what you end up having is a board made up of a bunch of novices, or people who are about to be unemployed, or short-termers about to leave, or both. Yeah. So it tends to lead to a worse outcome, at least from the opponent's perspective.
Yeah.
And that takes us to back to Jeannie with Measure Z.
Yeah, so here I am with another bond issue. The question is, should the Palo Alto Unified School District issue $460 million in bonds to fund school facility projects? The situation, the voters approved the $378 million strong schools bond measure in 2008 to fund a variety of infrastructure projects at Palo Alto school sites. These funds addressed only half of the facility needs. So the proposal is that additional repairs, upgrades, modernization, safety, accessibility, and security improvements are needed to support the educational programs. This bond measure describes in detail the kinds of projects to be financed and the proceeds of the bonds. An independent Citizens Oversight Committee will be established to ensure that bond proceeds are expended only for projects listed. The fiscal effect. If the measure passes, PAUSD would be authorized to sell up to $460 million in bonds to finance school facilities through fiscal year 2045-46. That is 2045. It is estimated that the highest tax rate, based on assessed valuations at the time of filing, is $39.40 per 100,000 of assessed valuation. So, this is a school construction issue. The bonds are required for changes in buildings. Supporters say the 2008 bond measure projects were completed on time and on budget, and this measure is the next phase to upgrade Palo Alto schools. PAUSD paid off bonds early, saving taxpayers millions, and maintains the highest credit rating for school districts. Supporters also say that Measure Z will ensure that schools are accessible, safe, secure, and modernized to support science, technology, instruction, and performing and visual arts programs. Funds obtained through the bond measure, they say, are locally controlled with strict fiscal accountability. Opponents to this measure say that the money funded through bonds will likely, with interest and principal payments, be double the cost to pay back. Opponents also say that PAUSD already has funds to provide everything in this bond measure. They also say that today's technology will be obsolete in 5 to 6 years, yet taxpayers will still be paying for all of this construction. That's Measure Z.
So, yeah, in conclusion, there are a ton of resources out there for you to get more information about these initiatives or any other initiatives or candidates out there. The internet is a wonderful place. The League of Women's Voters has lots of places where you can collect this information. There are other wonderful sites out there that are not associated with the League of Women Voters. There's just a ton of resources. Please take advantage of them.
Thank you for listening to us, and we hope that the narrative really helped you dig through some of the details that are out there in paper. It can be daunting. The last thing that I would say to it is we don't have to vote for everything that's on a ballot. I know that the very number of things on the ballot deter people from voting. And so I want to urge people to just become educated about some of the things that you care about, and then be able to vote for those things on November 6th. Thank you.
All right.
All right.